When we talk about the will of God, it gets rather complicated because in the New Testament, there are two different, distinctive Greek words, both of which are translated by the English word will. And it would be nice to say that if you wanted to know which kind of the will of God the text was speaking of in a given situation, we look in the Greek and we say, well, if it's one word, it's that meaning. If it's the other word, it's other. Unfortunately, those two words are often used interchangeably, so that doesn't help. But from the context of Scripture, we do distinguish among several different words with respect to the will of God. For example, we speak of his sovereign, efficacious will, and we define that as that will which comes to pass by necessity from the very force of God's exercising that will. Sometimes we refer to that as the decretive will. For whatever God decrees, necessarily, by the force of his sovereignty, comes to pass. But then we distinguish also the preceptive will of God. This is where God reveals to us the commandments that he gives, that he wants us to obey. But the very fact that God commands us to love him with all of our heart is not a sovereign, efficacious act of his will, or we would automatically love him with all of our hearts. That is to say, we can resist and disobey. In fact, we do disobey the preceptive will all the time. And then we talk about the will of desire, or his effective will, what it has to do with God's disposition, that it doesn't please him to send the wicked to hell. He takes no delight in the death of the wicked in the sense of a gleeful enjoyment of their negative outcome. Nevertheless, he still decrees or commands these people to be punished. And there are other nuances of the will of God that we can find in the New Testament, but those are the three most significant and most frequently used. A passage you hear all the time in discussion is that one that Peter uses when he says, God is not willing that any should perish. What does that mean? Well, if it's his sovereign, efficacious will, then what? No one would perish, or at least no one in the category of any of which he's described. I hear that passage, God is not willing that any should perish. I first ask, any what? Any grasshoppers, any orangutans, any human beings? Well, if you want to find the answer to that, you look to the antecedent of the word, and it's the word us. God is not willing that any of us should perish. So if that's the case, then I would assume that's the sovereign will of God. If it means not any person, then the text proves too much. It would mean that God is sovereignly decreeing that nobody perishes, and if that's the case, no one would perish. And so it gets very complicated when you get to the individual texts, but the individual text has to be interpreted by the immediate context of the text and the context of the rest of Scripture before we land definitively on which particular view of the will of God is being used.